Hello. Today's story is one of those that makes even the most hardened skeptics question their usual view of the world. This is not just a story about a missing person. It is a chronicle of an encounter with something that does not fit into our understanding. In November 2001, 47-year-old hunter Bill Hartman entered the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas and disappeared. A week later, he was found. Or rather, what was left of him. His skeleton lay in a shallow depression, pressed into the ground, with such force that it looked as if a multi-ton press had been dropped on top of it. There was not a single trace around. This story is an attempt to reconstruct the events that led to such a monstrous and inexplicable outcome. Bill Hartman's story begins as simply as can be. On Thursday, November 15, 2001, he was getting ready to go hunting, as he had done dozens of times before. Bill was no novice or thrill-seeker. At 47, he was an experienced, level-headed man who knew the woods better than the streets of his hometown. Hunting was not a sport for him, but a way to be alone with nature and get away from the hustle and bustle. He worked as a mechanic in a small workshop on the outskirts of Clarksville, Arkansas, and his fall trip to the Ozark National Forest was an annual tradition for him. His wife, Sarah Hartman, later told investigators that Bill was in a great mood that morning. He carefully checked his old but reliable Ford pickup truck, loaded his gear, a tent, 3 days' worth of food, and his trusty .30-30 Marlin rifle. He kissed his wife goodbye and promised to be back Sunday evening for dinner. There was nothing in his behavior to suggest anything was wrong. He was headed for familiar territory, the Big Piney Creek area, a wild but well-traveled part of the country. When Bill didn't return on Sunday, Sarah wasn't worried at first. Bill could get caught up in tracking a deer and decide to stay out another night. It happened, though rarely. But when he didn't show up on Monday morning and didn't call from work, she began to worry. She called the Johnson County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher took her statement, but as is often the case in such situations, the case was not taken seriously at first. An experienced hunter was delayed in the woods, a standard problem. She was advised to wait another day. On Tuesday, November 20th, when there was still no word from Bill, an official search began. The first thing the patrol found was his pickup truck. The car was parked in a small, unofficial parking lot at the beginning of one of the forest trails, exactly where Bill usually left it. The doors were locked, and everything inside was in order. There were no signs of a break-in or a struggle. This meant one thing. Bill had made it to his destination safely and gone into the woods along his planned route. Volunteers immediately joined the search, mostly local hunters, friends, and acquaintances of Bill. These people knew the woods as well as he did. They split into groups and began combing the area, moving out from the car's parking spot. The weather was typical for Arkansas in November, cool, damp, with frequent fog in the mornings. The leaves had almost all fallen from the trees, which, on the one hand, improved visibility, but on the other, made the ground slippery and treacherous. The first 2 days of searching yielded absolutely nothing. The group searched all the known trails and Bill's favorite hiding places, but found no trace of him. No campfire, no shell casings, no discarded gloves. It was strange. Bill Hartman was a neat man and always left clues behind that could be used to find him. He wasn't the type to stray from the trail unless necessary. The alarm grew. The Ozark Forest is not a city park. It's hundreds of thousands of acres of hilly, rugged terrain with thick undergrowth, ravines, and rocky outcroppings. A person could disappear without a trace here. The breakthrough came on the third day of the search, on Thursday. One of the groups, led by Bill's old friend Dale, decided to deviate from the main route and check out a small, rarely visited clearing about 4 miles from where the pickup truck had been parked. That's where they stumbled upon Bill's camp. The tent was neatly pitched with a cold fire pit nearby. Inside the tent, a sleeping bag was spread out but appeared untouched. Next to the fire pit was a camping pot with the remains of a dinner that seemed to have been cooked on Friday. The food supplies were almost untouched. There were no rifles in the camp. It looked as if Bill had gotten up and left the camp, intending to return soon. But he didn't come back. A search of the camp raised even more questions. Dale, an experienced tracker, noticed one detail. The ground around the camp was covered with wet leaves, but he found no clear tracks leading from the camp. Tracks were leading to where Bill had arrived and set up camp, but there was no trail indicating the direction he had gone hunting that last morning. This was highly unusual. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The search coordinator, the deputy sheriff who arrived at the scene, ordered the search radius to be expanded, with the camp as the center. Now they were not just looking for a missing person, but a person who had probably had an accident. All possibilities were considered: accident, bear attack, even foul play, although the latter was unlikely in such a remote area. For the next 3 days, searchers methodically combed square after square. The terrain became increasingly complex. Deep ravines overgrown with blackberries, streams with steep, slippery banks. Hope of finding Bill alive faded with each passing hour. On Sunday, November 25th, exactly 1 week after Bill was supposed to return home, the search party, making its way through the damp, shady lowlands about 1.5 miles northwest of the camp, made a gruesome discovery. One of the volunteers, a young man, noticed a piece of bright orange fabric peeking through the dead leaves ahead. It was the color of Bill's hunting vest. As the group approached, everyone froze in shock. The scene that met their eyes defied all logical explanation. At the bottom of the hollow, right in the center, were the remains of Bill Hartman, more precisely his skeleton, with fragments of clothing still attached. He was lying on his back, but not just lying there. He was imprinted in the ground. Around the body, the soil and leaves were pressed into a perfectly flat circle, about 6 or 7 feet in diameter, as if something weighty and flat had been pressed down on this spot with tremendous force. The skeleton itself was unnaturally flattened. The first thing that caught the eye of the investigators who arrived on the scene was the condition of the bones. The rib cage was destroyed. The ribs were broken into fragments and pressed into the ground. The pelvic bones were split, but the most gruesome sight was the spine. It was not broken, but crushed vertically downward, as if a monstrous blow from above had struck it. The skeleton's legs were still wearing his heavy hunting boots. 3 feet from the remains lay his Marlin rifle. The butt was broken in half, and the barrel was bent. The investigators and the medical examiner, who had struggled to reach the site, were completely baffled. The initial examination of the scene provided no answers, only raising new questions. First, there were no footprints around the indentation or leading up to it, neither human nor animal, and indeed no traces of machinery. No bulldozer or other heavy machine could have driven through this wilderness without leaving a trail of broken trees behind. Second, the nature of the damage. The expert immediately said that he had never seen anything like it. It did not look like a fall from a height. In that case, the body would have had different fractures and would have been lying differently. It was not a bear attack. There were no claw or tooth marks, no characteristic lacerations, and a bear would not have trampled its victim so neatly. Moreover, the remains were almost entirely skeletonized, a process that could occur within a week in cool weather. Still, wild animals that would have torn the flesh apart would inevitably have scattered the bones. Here, however, the skeleton lay in perfect anatomical order, except that it was flattened. One of the first people to arrive at the scene later shared anonymously in an interview that the most gruesome detail was the complete absence of any struggle. The rifle lay nearby, unfired. The bullets were in the magazine. Bill Hartman, an experienced hunter, did not even try to defend himself. Either he didn't have time, or he didn't see the threat until the very last moment. The place was permeated with an atmosphere of absolute silence and wrongness. Volunteers who had seen all kinds of things in the forest stood silently, unable to find the words. They found Bill, but the way they found him was worse than any guess about his fate. The preliminary conclusion recorded in the report right there on the spot sounded like nonsense. Death by blunt force trauma from a heavy object applied vertically from above. But no one could even guess what that object was, or where it could have come from in the remote Arkansas forest. An investigation began, which was destined to reach a dead end and become overgrown with the most incredible rumors. The official investigation into Bill Hartman's death was dead in the water from the start, as deep and impassable as the ravine where his body was found. The Johnson County Sheriff's Office and Arkansas State Crime Scene. Investigators were faced with a set of facts that contradicted each other and every known precedent. The scene was processed with the utmost care. Every square inch of the indented circle and the ground around it was examined, photographed, and analyzed. The results of this analysis only thickened the fog of uncertainty. First, as already mentioned, there were no traces whatsoever. Wildlife experts called in to investigate unanimously stated that no known animal in North America could have left such a scene. A grizzly bear, with its enormous strength, would have left deep claw marks, overturned earth, and scattered remains. A cougar acts differently, dragging its prey away to hide it. A pack of wolves or coyotes would also have left a completely different picture. The tree falling theory was immediately dismissed. There was not a single fallen or broken tree trunk within dozens of meters that could have produced such an effect. Second, the medical examiner's report, which was released a few weeks later, became a document that sparked more rumors than official explanations. The report said the cause of death was massive compression trauma, followed by asphyxia. Bill Hartman was crushed. The force required to inflict such injuries, splitting the pelvic bones and flattening the spinal column, was estimated to be equivalent to the weight of a passenger car dropped from a low height. The expert emphasized that the pressure was applied evenly over a large area, rather than at a single point. This ruled out a blow from a boulder or something similar. It was pressure. No foreign fibers, wool, or organic materials were found on Hartman's clothing, except for those consistent with the local flora and fauna, his DNA, and nothing else. The broken Marlin rifle was also examined under a microscope. Weapons experts concluded that the stock had been broken and the barrel bent as a result of enormous bending force, not from hitting the ground when it fell. It was as if the weapon had been taken by both ends and bent at an invisible knee. Investigators worked out the human factor down to the smallest detail. Bill Hartman was a man with an impeccable reputation. He had no enemies, no debts, and no family problems. He did not use drugs and rarely drank alcohol. The robbery theory was ruled out immediately. His wallet, found in his pants pocket, contained about $80 in cash. All of his gear, except for a broken rifle, was in the camp. No one stood to gain from his death. The case was officially classified as death by accident under unknown circumstances, and quietly filed away 6 months later. For the justice system, Bill Hartman's story was over. But for those who knew him and participated in the search, it was just beginning. Dale, Bill's friend who found his camp, couldn't accept the official version. He was an old-school hunter and believed that the forest always leaves clues. You have to know how to read them. In the winter of 2002, about 3 months after the tragedy, he returned to the same spot. Arkansas doesn't get much snow, and the ground was mostly bare. The round dent in the low spot was still clearly visible, although its edges had begun to crumble. Dale walked around for hours, trying to find what the investigators had missed, and he saw it. It wasn't the marks on the ground that caught his attention, but the trees surrounding the depression. The mighty oaks and hickories surrounding the clearing looked strange. About 30 or 40 feet above the ground, several thick branches were broken. These were not old, dry breaks caused by wind or age. The wood at the breaks was light in color, fresh, with splinters sticking down. And they were not broken randomly. The branches on 3 different trees, forming a triangle around the low spot, were broken off from top to bottom, as if something substantial and heavy had torn through the crowns, descending to the very place where Bill was found. No investigator had thought to look up that high and examine the tops of the trees. This discovery completely changed the picture. The absence of footprints on the ground could only mean one thing. Whatever killed Bill did not come from the ground, but from the air, or more precisely, from the trees. At first, Dale's observation was dismissed as the fantasy of a grief-stricken friend, but he was persistent. He brought a couple more hunters to the site, and they confirmed that the breaks were fresh and inexplicable. This information began to circulate in the small circles of the local hunting community, gathering new details. And then another story surfaced. It was told by an elderly farmer whose house stood on the edge of the national forest, about 10 miles from where Hartman had died. He had been questioned during the initial investigation, but had not reported anything significant. Now, however, having heard talk of the strange circumstances, he remembered one detail. On that very Friday, November 16th, when Bill was supposedly still alive, the farmer went out onto his porch late in the evening. The night was quiet and windless, and in that silence he heard a strange sound coming from the forest. It was not a coyote howling or a bear roaring. The farmer described it as a low, vibrating hum, almost on the verge of audibility. It was a sound that could be felt in the chest, rather than heard with the ears. The hum continued for about a minute, and then stopped abruptly. Immediately afterwards, there was a loud, dry crack, like a gunshot or a giant tree breaking. The farmer decided it was poachers, or just an old dry oak tree falling, and didn't think much of it. But now, comparing the timing and the stories about the broken branches, he wasn't so sure. These two pieces of evidence, the broken treetops and the strange sound, began to form a single, frightening mosaic. There was no place in it for humans or any animal known to science. Old, half-forgotten legends started to surface in conversations in local bars and gun shops, stories that their grandfathers had told their children. Stories about the black predator of the hills, or the Ozark screamer, a large, dark creature that lives in trees, moves almost silently, and makes strange sounds. Previously, these stories were considered folklore, scary tales for tourists. But after Bill Hartman's death, these stories no longer seemed so fantastical. The description of the creature in these legends was vague, but some details matched the new facts strikingly well. It was said to be huge and heavy, yet capable of moving with incredible agility through the treetops, rarely coming down to the ground. It hunted not for food, but to defend its territory, and its method of attack was to jump from above, using its entire weight to crush its opponent. It was also mentioned that it emitted a low, guttural growl before attacking. Of course, these were just speculations and legends, but they provided at least some, albeit fantastical, explanation for what the official investigation had failed to find. The picture that emerged was as follows. Bill Hartman hunting game at dusk or dawn, entered the creature's territory. He may not even have suspected the danger. The threat did not come from the ground, but it watched him from above. The creature, following its instinct, swooped down on him from a tree, bringing its entire weight down on the hunter. This explained the nature of the injuries, the broken branches, the lack of footprints on the ground, and the broken rifle. Bill was killed instantly without even realizing what had happened. This theory, as wild as it seemed, was the only one that tied together all the strange facts of the Hartman case. It did not answer the main question: what was this creature? But it did provide an understanding of the mechanism of his death, and that understanding was far more terrifying than any official version of an accident. It meant that something large, powerful, and utterly unknown to science lived in the dense, ancient forests of Ozark. Something that considered these forests its home and was ready to kill anyone who crossed its borders. And Bill Hartman's death was not an accident, but the inevitable result of an encounter with the master of these places.